Our fourth speaker is Professor Essie Viding, who's Professor of Developmental Psychopathology and Co-Director of the Developmental Risk and Resilience Unit. And she's going to speak on developmental cognitive neuroscience, a new approach to mental health in young people. Essie.
I'm not sure that was... I think you've got the wrong title.
Well, everyone is... Well, you've all changed your titles, but that's fine.
We'll improvise. So the title is How Can Neurocognitive Research Improve Our Understanding of Environmental Risk? And what I really want to review during this talk is where we have come to in combining multiple levels of analysis and make the case for the fact that we need to do that within a developmental framework if we want to understand emergence of mental health problems. So 50% of mental health problems begin by the age of 14, 75% by the age of 24. No one gets a psychiatric disorder as a birthday present when they turn 18. There are signs and antecedents to these problems early on, and we need to understand development in order to understand how we can best prevent and treat mental health problems. And in order to really progress, we need to combine multiple different methodologies in a longitudinal, developmental, genetically informative framework. And my inclusion of genetics is really a plea for a better understanding of environment as well. So it's not just in order to understand genetic risk, but in order to also understand how the environmental risk operates, and I will talk about that a little bit later on. And to illustrate the kind of work that we might be doing and where we might want to take it, I'm going to talk about conduct problems, which are antecedent to multiple different psychiatric problems in later life. So conduct problems involve behaviors such as aggression, violence, theft, lying, and they can lead to persistent antisocial behavior, which in and of itself is a very serious condition, but they can also lead to a variety of other physical and mental health problems, and also a number of problems with employment and schooling and so on and so forth. Now, individuals who have conduct problems in childhood form a heterogeneous population, so they don't all have identical presentation and identical risk factors. And one way in which we can subtype these individuals is by charting their so-called callous unemotional traits. So children who have conduct problems and also have these callous unemotional traits lack empathy for other people, lack remorse, are capable of premeditated, planned, aggressive acts. In contrast, children who have conduct problems but don't have high levels of callous unemotional traits are often impulsively aggressive. They have clear triggers for their aggressive acts. They might feel threatened, they might feel frustrated. And because of this slightly different behavioral profile, psychologists have been interested in trying to understand what might be the cognitive emotional factors that sort of are both in common among these children but also may differentiate them. And something that seems to be in common for most children with conduct problems is atypical reinforcement learning. So the ability to make a connection between something they have done and punishment consequence that follows is not optimal. But there are differences as well. So children who have conduct problems and low levels of callous and emotional traits seem to have a tensional bias to negative emotional stimuli, are prone to interpreting even neutral emotional stimuli and social stimuli as potentially hostile, and they experience emotional arousal to other people's distress as measured by psychophysiological indicators. In contrast, the children who have conduct problems and high levels of callous and emotional traits have difficulty in processing other people's distress and pain, and they also have difficulties in processing positive emotion that promotes affiliation to other people. They report feeling less fear themselves, so perhaps they have difficulty in understanding these emotions in others because it's not something that is part of their experience base. And they lack psychophysiological arousal to other people's distress. When people have focused on neural features that might underlie conduct problems in children, they have documented atypical functioning of the reinforcement circuitry of the brain in children with conduct problems. So this may explain why they have this difficulty in forming the connection between what they've done and the consequences that follow. But we have also seen some differences, again, between the low callous and high callous groups. So children who have conduct problems and low levels of callous and emotional traits, so exaggerated or in some cases typical responses to other people's pain and distress. In contrast, children who have conduct problems and high levels of callous and emotional traits show atypically low reactivity in key affect processing regions of the brain, such as the amygdala and insula, to other people's distress and also to other people's positive emotions that promote feelings of belonging and group cohesion. Our work has also focused on the etiology of conduct problems in these two different groups of children. I think we've lost the labels from there, but here is the low CU and here is the high CU group. We can use twin studies to look at the relative importance of genetic and environmental factors in the individual differences in antisocial behavior, i.e. conduct problems in children. And what we see by doing this work is that for the group with low levels of callous and emotional traits, the shared and non-shared environmental influences account for majority of the difference between these children and the rest of the population in conduct problems. In contrast, for the group with high callous and emotional traits, there seems to be a strong genetic risk predisposing these children to develop conduct problems, and also some non-shared child-specific environmental factors that play a role. Now, this doesn't mean that these children are somehow genetically destined to become antisocial. Nobody is born antisocial. But what we can take away from this work is that there are some children that are at a higher genetic risk for developing behavioral problems, and others for whom there are strong environmental risk factors which predispose to their antisocial behavior. Now, this is all interesting work, but most of it hasn't been done in a longitudinal context, combining multiple levels of analysis, and most of it hasn't really included both environmental and genetic risk factors in the same study. So how can we further progress from this exciting starting point, our understanding of developmental trajectories to psychiatric problems, and also, conversely, to resilience? And I would argue that in this context, we really need to stop thinking about the brain just as a receiver of environments, but also think about it as a creator of environments. And I think that cognitive neuroscience could be a very exciting tool for us to understand environmental risk and how it unfolds. And we need to bring study of gene-environment correlation and environment-environment correlation into cognitive neuroscience, and we need to use cognitive neuroscience methods to help our understanding of how environmental risk unfolds. And Sonia was mentioning this a little bit in her talk when she was talking about the relationship between mental health problems and loneliness, and how there is crosstalk over development, with one thing leading to another and then precipitating the other in return. So gene-environment correlation refers to the fact that many of the social environmental risk factors that are associated with many mental health problems don't occur as random. We have both passive effects, where parents who have certain vulnerable dispositions pass on the genetic risk for that disposition. They may engage in parenting that is harsh and ill thought out, and they may pass on temperamental risk factors for difficult, dysregulated temperament for their children. So you may have a correlation between harsh parenting and child problem behavior, but some of that correlation may be an epiphenomenon of familial vulnerability. We have evocative gene-environment correlation effects, and anybody who has more than one child knows that this is real. If I had stopped after my daughter, I would have a very inflated sense of my parenting ability, because she's an extremely easy child. And then my son came along and keeps me humble. He's very much more difficult than my daughter, and is a good example of evocative gene-environment correlation effects. Two children with different temperamental dispositions evoking very different reactions in me as their parent. Later on in life, people engaged in also active gene-environment correlation behaviors, where they seek out activities that correspond with their particular proclivities. We know there are heritable individual differences in social information processing, in reasoning, in our ability to regulate affect. And this is going to impact upon how the children behave and what they optimally respond to in their environment. And also, it's going to impact how the caregivers or peers behave and how they react to the child. And these genetic and neurocognitive vulnerabilities will restrict the range of possible social, and in some cases, non-social inputs over development. And shared vulnerabilities between the child and the caregiver may actually undermine the caregiver's capacity to respond to the needs of the child. So if you have a particularly difficult, dysregulated child and a parent who's not very good at emotion regulation, that's a very, very vulnerable combination. In addition to gene-environment correlation, environment-environment correlation is also likely to be very, very important. We know that children who grow up in adverse environments adapt to those adverse environments. This is what your brain is for. It's a learning organ. It's trying to survive in a particular environment. If you have an environment which is very threatening or where you can't count on having your basic needs met, your brain is going to adapt to that particular environment. It may adapt in a way that is useful for that particular environmental need, but becomes maladaptive when the child tries to function in a mainstream society. So Eamon McCrory and myself have focused on studying children who've experienced childhood maltreatment in order to try and understand the ways in which their brains adapt to adverse environments and how that might impact their risk for developing mental health problems. And one of the studies that we did some years back now, we documented that children who had grown up in family environments that were characterized by violence showed heightened neural reactivity to threat. And this is very adaptive if you grow up in an environment that is dangerous and you don't know where the next hit is going to come from. But it's not going to be very adaptive for when you're trying to interact with your peers and teachers in an environment that is not characterized by that adversity. And we think that this adaptation that the children make or their brains make to these environments create latent vulnerability to future stresses. First of all, these children are going to be in an acute heightened state of stress more of the time than their peers because they perceive even benign expressions as potentially threatening. But this sort of reactivity may also include reactions to social situations which alienate them from their peers, from important adults, and lead to social thinning and reduced social support over time. So I think we need to start thinking about individuals as active creators of some of their important environments. And I wanted to spend a few minutes thinking about what this might look like for children with high levels of conduct problems and callous and emotional traits, or those with lower levels of callous and emotional traits, based on what we know so far. And what we know so far about the group with conduct problems and high callous and emotional traits is that they are compromised in a number of neurocognitive domains that are important for achieving successful socialization. You are not going to be able to do empathy induction effectively with these children to teach them about consequences of their action because they don't have the typical reaction to other people's distress. Punishments are not working so well, so sanctions for bad behavior are not going to be working as effectively for these children. And it also appears that they don't have the typical reaction to positive emotions that promote social affiliation. And something that we do often with small children is we try and get them to help us, to please us, and they like to do it, and this is how they display pro-social behavior. And again, this is something that is not functioning well for these children. And this is going to create a very different caregiver-child dynamic or peer-child dynamic than you see for typically developing children who have the ability to empathize, who react to punishments, and who want to affiliate with other people. For children with conduct problems and low callous and emotional traits, we see excessive arousal to perceived threat, and this may be partly due to genetic vulnerability, but in many cases due to environmental circumstances that these children have grown up in. We also see poor ability to compute consequences of behavior in this group of children as well. So if they see something benign in a social interaction and interpret it actually as threatening, they are much more likely to respond with threat-reactive aggression. This sort of erratic behavior is not very well tolerated by other people. This will no doubt lead to reduced social support over time, which will reinforce your perception of the world as a hostile place. The challenge that we have going forward is to try and understand causal mechanisms at different levels of analysis, delineate how these mechanisms unfold across development, and how the different levels of analysis relate to each other across development. And it is no small task, but I think that at UCL we are extremely well positioned to achieve this. To date, we have also had a lot of focus on risk in our studies, but we often can do very little about risk beyond perhaps bigger societal interventions, but at least things that happen in the family, they tend to come to our attention once the ship has already at least partly sailed. So I think we need to get better at trying to study systematically potential protective factors that we can use to build resilience. I think UCL is in prime position to do this sort of multidisciplinary work, and we can really do something that is innovative and hasn't been done before. We have a wealth of knowledge and methodological expertise around here. We have computational psychiatry, we have the big cohorts. I think we should be combining these resources, and I, for instance, have recently been talking about Quentin Hughes, who does computational psychiatry, about how we can develop better methods, more psychometrically sound ways of assessing particular cognitive domains, and roll these out in a big scale to try and understand how mental health vulnerability comes about. And I'm hoping that the UCL Institute of Mental Health will be a real vehicle for promoting this kind of interdisciplinary work that we are uniquely placed to do at UCL. Thank you.